Good afternoon. I think we'll have to start again because we didn't have an audio feed when we began initially. My name is Rajiv Kumar. I am the Associate Dean for Academics at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Welcome to this, the 11th edition of the National COVID Grand Rounds that we've been now doing for about 3 months, beginning in July this year. The grand round today, as in the previous rounds, would be moderated by Professor Randeep Guleria, the director of this institution. He'll be joining us shortly, and in order to keep to time, we've decided to start, and he will join us midway. The topic for discussion today will be COVID-19 with other co-infections, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists for today's discussion. It's a pleasure to have Professor Rohit Sareen, former director of the LRS Institute of Tuberculosis and Respiratory Diseases in New Delhi, who will be joining us via a video link. Thank you, Professor Sareen, for accepting our invitation. On my left is Professor Aarti Kapil, Professor of Microbiology here at AIIMS New Delhi. On my right is Professor Anant Mohan. He is the Professor and Head of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine, Critical Care and Sleep Disorders at AIIMS. Also joining us subsequently in the discussions are the three faculty who are presenting cases and presenting the discussions. The faculty are Dr. Ved from the Department of Medicine, Dr. Saurabh Mittal, Assistant Professor in the Department of Pulmonary Medicine, and also Dr. Pavan, who's an Assistant Professor in the Department of Pulmonary Medicine. There is a large number of infections that are prevalent apart from COVID-19, and it is no longer uncommon to see patients presenting with a combination of infections. And in the last few weeks, we've also seen a number of cases with dengue co-infecting with COVID-19, and you often come across clinical dilemmas, particularly in conditions which cause hemorrhage, where you need to give anticoagulants, but also need to wonder whether you should give anticoagulants or not in a patient who has a bleeding manifestation because of dengue. You also have immunosuppressed patients with tuberculosis, and again, you need to reconsider your strategy of giving an anti-IL-6 drug or an anti-immunosuppressant in a patient who has active tuberculosis or even HIV. And therefore, the case scenarios that will be presented today will cover some of these co-infections, and in our discussion we will try and address these issues of where you probably end up in a dilemma of whether one strategy of intervention is better than the other. So to begin with, as we do in the other grand rounds, we will have three cases, and the first two cases will be presented by Dr. Saurabh Mittal, Assistant Professor in the Department of Pulmonary Medicine. So I request Dr. Saurabh to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So today we will be discussing two important patients who had COVID and some other infections. So our first patient is a 57-year-old female, a housewife who was a non-smoker, who presented to us with fever, which was high grade for last 7 days. She also had shortness of breath, which has progressed to grade 3 over last 5 days, and she also had dry cough for last 5 days. In the past history, the patient had history of diabetes mellitus on oral treatment, but it was poorly controlled. She also had hypertension, chronic kidney disease, which was diagnosed 1 year back. In the background, she had history of pulmonary tuberculosis in 2019. The chest X-ray which was done in 2019 is shown here, which shows a right upper lobe cavitary lesion. For this, patient had taken 4 to 5 months of ATT, but then she lost to follow-up and did not complete the treatment. So at presentation to us, she was conscious, oriented, hemodynamically stable, but she had respiratory distress, and she was requiring oxygen of around 10 liters per minute to maintain an oxygen saturation of 95%. In the emergency, patient's COVID rapid antigen testing was done, and she was found to be positive. So because of the illness, she was admitted in COVID facility for further management. This was the chest radiograph which was performed at the time of admission, and it shows the patient had bilateral consolidation, nodules, and a small right upper lobe cavitary lesion. Initial blood investigation showed that she had anemia. Although her blood counts were normal, she had a high creatinine which was 2.4 milligram per deciliter at the time of admission, and she had mild transaminitis at the time of admission. Her further investigations in view of the severe COVID illness was done. She was found to have raised IL-6 levels, raised ferritin. Her procalcitonin was normal, although CRP and lactate were high. So thus we reached the diagnosis of severe COVID-19 illness. Because of the COVID, patient was managed with high flow nasal cannula, and she required up to 80% of FiO2 for management. She was also initiated on steroid therapy with methylprednisolone in the dose of 40 milligrams twice daily. She received supportive care in form of vitamin C as well as anticoagulation in form of dalteparin. Because patient had an infection, she was initiated on broad-spectrum antibiotic therapy in the form of ceftriaxone and doxycycline. But the major issue was that she had poorly controlled diabetes, for which we had to give her insulin infusion. Her initial blood cultures as well as urine cultures were sterile, but she was unable to produce sputum for examination. What happened that we treated her for COVID illness along with antibiotics, but she continued to have high-grade fever along with high oxygen requirement till day 10 of her illness. Because her fever was continuous and she was continuing to require high oxygen, antibiotic escalation was done and she was shifted to piperacillin tazobactam along with levofloxacin. Because of the persistent fever, antifungal therapy was also initiated, and because of raised inflammatory markers, methylprednisolone dose was increased to 40 milligrams thrice a day. And she also received awake proning while she was receiving high FiO2 on high flow nasal cannula. She gradually improved with this therapy, but she continued to require 8 to 10 liters of oxygen, and her low-grade fever continued to persist. So because by the day 14, her oxygen requirement was still there, so steroids were being continued, we decided to go ahead with a CT scan of the chest to find out the cause of her fever and the shortness of breath. So the CT scan which was done at this point of time showed that she had bilateral lung nodules and consolidation. There were multiple areas of tree in bud appearance, multiple central lobular nodules, along with the right upper lobe cavitary lesion, and a radiological diagnosis of tuberculosis was made. She was initiated on empirical anti-tubercular therapy because she was not able to produce any sputum for the examination. She was initiated with 4-drug conventional therapy of isoniazid, rifampicin, ethambutol, and pyrazinamide. In view of active tuberculosis, we planned to reduce the steroid therapy, but she had high oxygen requirement, so high doses of steroids were still continued. After around 15 days of her illness, she was transferred from a COVID facility to AIIMS isolation ward. Her oxygen requirement gradually reduced to 2 liters per minute, and after a total of 3 weeks, we started initiating the tapering of her steroid therapy. On day 20, she was able to produce some sputum, and we diagnosed her as MTB detected on gene expert examination. But another important thing was that she was found to have rifampicin resistance on gene expert examination. This was the chest radiograph which was performed 3 weeks into illness, which shows there are bilateral multiple confluent nodules along with the right upper lobe cavity. And this X-ray is consistent with tuberculosis. So thus, we had a patient who had a final diagnosis of severe COVID pneumonia with ARDS, along with MDR tuberculosis. She also had uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, chronic kidney disease, anemia, as well as systemic hypertension. So once patient has been transferred to the isolation facility, in view of her poor renal function, we did not start her on injectable drugs for MDR tuberculosis. So we have decided to start her on all oral longer MDR TB regimen, which is bedaquiline based. This has been just initiated few days back. We plan to monitor her renal function as well as blood sugars and continue to monitor for the adverse effects of the therapy. Another important thing for this patient is because she had lost her previous follow-up for tuberculosis, that we need to ensure the compliance to the treatment. And currently patient is being managed with multidisciplinary management with nephrology, pulmonary medicine, and endocrinology review. So that's how we were able to manage this patient, and we need to follow her up to look at the drug side effects and efficacy of the treatment. So what we learned from this patient was that if a patient who is not responding to supportive care, we need to have a high suspicion of a co-infection. Secondly, it may be difficult to establish a microbiological diagnosis for patients who have active COVID-19 because they may not be in a situation to provide a good sputum sample. Thirdly, we used steroids in this patient, but steroids for severe COVID can also lead to worsening of the co-infections. And because patients had infections, so we had to use antibiotics in the form of levofloxacin, which itself may lead to delay in the diagnosis of tuberculosis. So what is important is that if you can, you should try to do an early imaging in the form of repeat radiographs or a CT scan, which may help in prompt diagnosis of tuberculosis in patients with COVID-19. So now we go to our second patient. Our second patient was a 62-year-old male who was non-smoker and a manual laborer. He had history of diabetes for 3 years, which was poorly controlled. He presented to the hospital with low-grade intermittent fever for 8 days, along with swelling of right eye for 1 week and shortness of breath for last 5 days. On examination, he was hemodynamically stable. On vital parameter examination, he was febrile. His respiratory rate was 26 per minute and it was acidotic breathing. His room air oxygen saturation was 89% and he also had tachycardia. His oropharyngeal RT-PCR for SARS-CoV was done, which was found to be positive. On further examination, what we found that the right upper third of the face was swollen and there was infraorbital tenderness. His right eye had proptosis, conjunctival congestion, and there was restriction of the extraocular movement. He also had right facial nerve palsy, and oral cavity examination revealed there was a black eschar on the hard palate. His blood sugar at the time of presentation was 480 milligram per deciliter. Urinary ketones were positive, and he had high anion gap metabolic acidosis on ABG. The chest X-ray performed at the time of admission demonstrated bilateral consolidation consistent with the diagnosis of COVID pneumonia. So initial lab investigation showed that patient had leukocytosis with neutrophilia. His platelet count was normal, renal and liver function was normal. But on inflammatory marker evaluation, he had elevation in CRP, ferritin, fibrinogen, but D-dimer was normal. So thus we made a clinical diagnosis of acute invasive fungal rhinosinusitis with severe COVID-19 and diabetic ketoacidosis. He was initiated on oxygen by face mask for his COVID illness and hypoxemia. And because of the high suspicion of fungal rhinosinusitis with poorly controlled blood sugars, empirical liposomal amphotericin B was initiated, along with broad spectrum antibiotics. For the management of diabetic ketoacidosis, he received insulin infusion, and for COVID, he received oral hydroxychloroquine at that point of time. So now the question was the patient had a severe COVID illness, so what to do with the steroid therapy? His further investigations were that scrapings from the crust and necrotic tissue from the middle turbinate and palate, which were sent for KOH examination, and it revealed, this is the calcofluor staining, where we can see there is a broad aseptate hyphae which are branching at the right angles consistent with the diagnosis of invasive mucormycosis. And this was the imaging of the head and neck done at that point of time, which shows that there was right orbital invasion, there was invasion of the infratemporal fossa, and there was right maxillary sinusitis with floor of the orbit was invaded by the fungus. So patient was initiated on oxygen therapy. We also gave him steroids because he was having severe COVID which was requiring oxygen therapy. So a dexamethasone in the dose of 6 milligrams once daily was initiated. For his illness, he also received insulin infusion, broad spectrum antibiotics, antifungals, and other supportive management. Now the important dilemma with us was whether we need to go ahead with surgery, because if you look at the management of rhinocerebral mucormycosis, the gold standard management is surgery. So initially we planned for a surgical debridement with total maxillectomy and exenteration of the orbit, but because of the concomitant severe COVID-19 along with uncontrolled diabetes, surgery was considered very high risk for the patient. And after discussion with the patient and a careful risk-benefit assessment, we deferred the surgery. So patient was continued on high-dose intravenous liposomal amphotericin B. And by day 7, he had significant improvement in terms of reduction of his cheek swelling, trismus, and the range of extraocular movements was also achieved. So if you can see that the conjunctival congestion edema has markedly improved over next 7 days. So we repeated a scan after 4 weeks of 4 grams of liposomal ampho, which showed significant resolution, and patient also clinically improved. As 4 weeks into the illness, patient had significantly improved. His hypoxemia had also gone down. So we went ahead with a infrastructural maxillectomy through the oral sublabial route, and this is the surgical specimen, and which also demonstrated there was invasion by the mucormycosis. So post-operatively, this patient had renal dysfunction, and we had to discontinue amphotericin B. So he was initiated on oral posaconazole, and after 49 days of hospital stay, he was discharged home on insulin therapy along with posaconazole. So the final diagnosis for this patient was severe COVID-19 with invasive rhino-orbital mucormycosis and diabetic ketoacidosis. So the challenges we faced in this patient was that, number one, a patient who had DKA with severe COVID-19, the use of steroids is very dicey. So we can use it, which can worsen the DKA, but it may help in the COVID illness. Number two, the patient's diagnosis in such situations sometimes may be delayed because an upper airway sampling is to be done in a patient who is COVID-19 positive. And thirdly, the decision for optimum timing for surgery is essential because surgery during active COVID is associated with higher morbidity and mortality. So a decision for deferring the surgery versus an urgent surgery had to be taken in this patient. Thank you. So now I'll request Dr. Ved to continue with the dengue patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saurabh. So before we take questions on these cases, maybe I'll just have a very quick question before we ask Ved to continue with his presentation. This question has come up on our WhatsApp number. If Dr. Sareen is available on Skype. So Dr. Sareen, the question that has come up is that when you have patients with COVID and tuberculosis co-infection, have elevated ALT or may have renal impairment as well, consider giving them a full course ATT or dose ATT.
Well, you see, the thing to understand, in fact, if we come to this case, there are a few issues which I would like to highlight here. One of the issues is that the patient in his earlier episode of TB treatment had not completed his treatment. So the first X-ray itself indicates that the individual may require anti-TB treatment. On a clinical suspicion, one could have started the anti-TB treatment. That is number one. Second thing is that the individual was given levofloxacin as an antibiotic, which I feel that, when we are suspecting TB, we should try to avoid that because it would be a single drug to be used for this illness, which is not correct. One would easily lead to quinolone resistance in a very short time. Especially with quinolone, it may lead to resistance between 10 to 14 days itself. So these are, first of all, two things regarding this. And then on the bedaquiline regimen, before we start putting, obviously, I'm sure that the other pre-treatment investigations would have been done prior to starting on this drug, and the background regimen would have been suitably chosen. Now, coming to your specific issue regarding starting anti-tubercular treatment in the presence of renal disease. Now, whether that renal disease is a consequence of COVID or otherwise, there are definite guidelines which we have, and the same is true for liver disease also. So there are certain drugs which the dosage may require a change if there is renal disease. Like ethambutol is mainly one of the drugs which is excreted via the kidneys, and we need to change the dosage. But all that is related to the GFR and creatinine clearance. So based on that, usually the drugs could be the same, but the dosage would alter if it was first line therapy. And if it is a second line treatment, like this individual is being given bedaquiline, then the drugs, the bedaquiline the dosage will remain the same. We are not going to alter the dose of bedaquiline. And same is true for the quinolone and the linezolid, which I'm sure would have been taken. So certain drugs we need to change the dose. Certain drugs we need to change the frequency of administering the drugs. That is, we could give it twice a week or 3 times a week, and monitor the ADRs at the same time very closely to see that the kidney function or the liver function doesn't get deranged to that extent.
Thank you, sir. So we'll move on to the third case and then maybe take the discussion on the cases subsequent to that. So I'm going to invite Dr. Wade, Assistant Professor in the Department of Medicine, to present the third case.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. So I am going to present the case of COVID-19 with dengue co-infection. Our patient was 22-year-old male patient, resident of Uttar Pradesh. He with no history of smoking or any other substance abuse. So patient was presented with a history of fever for last 3 days, which was high grade, associated with no chills or rigor. A headache for 3 days, which was holocranial, moderate in intensity, with no associated vomiting or altermentation. There was no history of any focal neurological deficit or any seizure episode. Patient also had dry cough for 3 days and shortness of breath for 1 day, with no other any systemic symptoms. So for these complaints, patient went to a healthcare facility where he was tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then shifted to NCI AIMS Jhajjar, which is a designated COVID facility for AIMS. On examination, patient was alert, conscious, oriented, and cooperative. Temperature was 101 degree Fahrenheit, heart rate was 88 per minute, respiratory rate was 24 per minute, and oxygen saturation was 91% on room air. There was no cutaneous rash noted. Other systemic examination was unremarkable. On initial evaluation, hemogram and liver function test and kidney function tests were normal. Inflammatory markers including interleukin 6, CRP, ferritin was slightly high. On X-ray, there was bilateral infiltrates more on the left side compared to right. So initial line of management was done for the moderate COVID pneumonia, and patient was started on injection remdesivir, methylprednisolone, anticoagulants, and other supportive management, including oxygen supplementation. Over the 2 days in the hospital, patient condition remained same with persistent oxygen requirement. And on 3 days after admission, laboratory value showed declining platelet count of 73,000 3 days after admission, and transaminitis with SGOT value of 164. So based on the thrombocytopenia and transaminitis, we kept differential diagnosis of malaria, dengue fever, COVID-19 associated ITP, thrombocytopenia is caused by COVID-19 itself, and lower in probability heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. For the above, additional workup was done, which revealed NS1 positivity by dengue rapid kit test. Malaria was negative both by rapid CAR test as well as peripheral smear. For inflammatory parameters, interleukin 6, CRP, ferritin revealed rising trend. D-dimer was also high. So for moderately severe COVID pneumonia, same treatment was continued with supportive management for dengue fever. During hospital course, further investigation revealed worsening platelet counts and liver enzymes. 7 days after admission, platelets were 29,000 and SGOT was in the range of thousands. For the above, antiviral injection remdesivir was stopped 4 days after admission, and anticoagulants were also stopped. Viral markers including for hepatitis A, B, C, and E were negative. After 7 days of admission, patient developed hemorrhagic manifestations in the form of petechial and ecchymotic lesions on bilateral upper limbs and nasal bleed. He also had complaint of abdominal pain, for which ultrasound abdomen was done, which revealed moderate ascites and bilateral mild pleural effusion. For the management of severe dengue, patient was shifted to COVID ICU, and fluid management was started on the lines of severe dengue illness. This chart is showing trends of laboratory parameters and management done during the course of hospital admission. So as you can see, on the day, 4 days after admission, platelet counts declined to around 53,000. At that time, deltaperin was stopped. After 7 days of admission, platelet count was around 25,000. At that time, because patient was having bleeding manifestation also, so 4 unit random donor platelets were given to the patients. After 9 days of admission, patient started having hemoconcentration, as you can see here. from 15 to hemoglobin rise to 16.4. At that time, bolus normal saline was given, 20 ml per kg, followed by 3 ml per kg per hour of normal saline. Patients showed improvement for the above conservative supportive management. As you can see, hemoglobin and hematocrit started improving, and after 10 days of admission, platelets also started rising. As you can see here also, there was transaminitis, SGOT rise in the range of above 3,000. And as already told, remdesivir was stopped after 4 days of admission in view of transaminitis. After 10 days of admission, patient improved, oxygen requirement decreased, and patient was kept on room air after that. So this was all about our present case. We also had 8 other cases of dengue COVID co-infection. All the dengue infection was mild except this case. Sorry. So out of 9 dengue COVID co-infection, 3 were having moderate, 3 were having moderate to severe dengue illness, and all the patients were mild except one patient for COVID infection. All the patients were improved and successfully discharged. So what we learned from this case is dengue and COVID infection may have similar clinical and laboratory features. So we should have low threshold for testing dengue in COVID-19 and vice versa. Because anticoagulation is warranted in moderate and severe COVID-19, in view of thrombocytopenia, continuation of anticoagulation to be balanced with the risk of bleeding and thrombosis. And COVID-specific antiviral drugs, remdesivir and favipiravir may have additional hepatotoxic effects here. And last point is COVID-19 may affect severity of dengue and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ved, and I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank both the speakers, Dr. Saurabh Mittal and Dr. Ved, for 3 excellent cases that we've just had. At the same time, take the opportunity to really welcome the panelists, Dr. Rohit Sareen, former Director, LRS Institute of Tuberculosis and Respiratory Diseases, Dr. Aarti Kapil, Professor of Microbiology at AIIMS, Dr. Anant Mohan, Professor and Head Pulmonary Medicine, Critical Care and Sleep Disorder at AIIMS New Delhi, and Dr. Manish Suneja, Additional Professor of Medicine at AIIMS New Delhi. We've just seen one case of dengue, and we are in the dengue season where we're having many cases who are coming now who are dengue positive. And if you have co-infection with these 2 viruses, it becomes a bigger challenge as far as managing both dengue and COVID-19 is concerned, because in one, you're actually giving anticoagulants because you're worried about a hypercoagulable state. And the other, you're actually worried about the fall in platelets and the shock syndrome that can happen, which can also cause problems. So I'll have one question which I'll probably ask Dr. Aarti Kapil. In terms of the testing that we do, does it have any effect? We look for NS1 antigen in the beginning and then for the antibodies for dengue. Should we really have any differences in terms of testing for both dengue and for COVID-19 in terms of our testing strategy?
Thank you, sir. So, regarding the testing strategies, it's not any different. It will remain the same. Only thing important is a high index of suspicion. So, simultaneously, we can collect samples for both. RT-PCR, of course, for the COVID-19 as soon as the patient comes and it's suspected. And for the dengue, we have to follow the algorithm that we are doing earlier also. First 3 to 4 days NS1 antigen, then within first week IgM, and followed by IgG. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think it's a very important thing to keep in mind, that what we must have is a high index of suspicion. And I think all the 3 cases highlighted that fact that if you have an atypical presentation or something which raises red flags, you must look for co-infection don't just go with the positive COVID-19 report and not really worry about the other infections that may be there. And you must really investigate for that. For dengue, as was already mentioned, in the first few days, till the fourth, fifth day, you could look for the NS1 antigen, and after that, for the antibodies, the IgM antibodies to begin with. Along with that, you can do the RT-PCR test also, or the CBNAT when you're looking at COVID-19. We'll take questions as far as co-infection with COVID-19 are concerned, because this is also an important issue, as we are now seeing patients with COVID-19 who will present with other infections. Dr. Ved presented a series of patients that they had seen with co-infection of COVID-19 with dengue. And I think it's important because this is the time that we have a spurt of cases as far as dengue is concerned, just during and after the monsoon months. So vector-borne diseases and the infections that we get along with COVID-19 are important issues. Before I go to the topic discussion, I just remind the audience to send their question through WhatsApp based on the number that is given below. I'll repeat that. It's 9999692364. That's 9999692364. And we'll have an esteemed panelist which will try and answer your questions. So we move on to the talk, which is managing COVID-19 with co-infections. There is now some data which has emerged as to the magnitude of co-infections with COVID-19 and how do we manage them in this era of COVID-19. And I'll request Dr. Pavan Tiwari, who is the Assistant Professor in Department of Pulmonary Medicine, Critical Care and Sleep Disorders, to present this topic. After this, we'll have the panel discussion. Dr. Pavan.
Thank you, sir. Very good afternoon to all attending the webinar. And subsequently, now we will just have an overview of managing COVID-19 with co-infections, a brief literature review, and the issues and challenges in managing these patients, which we all of us will encounter in coming near future. So introducing the topic, co-infections are an important concern, especially in COVID-19. That is, if we talk of bacterial and fungal infections. We all of us prescribe broad spectrum antibiotics to all patients who are admitted with COVID-19, but it is actually more in fear rather than based on evidence of co-infection. Then there are endemic diseases like tuberculosis. All of us know that tuberculosis is a common cause of community-acquired pneumonia in endemic countries like India, and up to 7% cases can actually present as CAP. COVID again is a community-acquired pneumonia, though it is viral. So that is also one important aspect. Then there are infections which have seasonality, which is like dengue and influenza, which is now coming up. And these are co-infections which are now increasingly being reported, and identifying them and managing them is important. Then there are other infections which are there in society, which are like HIV and hepatitis. These are also co-infections which need to be looked for. Whether these infections are bystanders or whether they are good or bad for COVID-19 and vice versa, we do not actually know at present. And there are individual management issues regarding all of these infections, which we will try and highlight in the next few slides. So looking at epidemiology, now we have a few systematic reviews which have looked at data from various observational studies which were prospective or retrospective. There are few very large observational studies which reported on co-infections, bacterial, fungal and viral. So this was a meta-analysis, a systematic review which was done 1.5 months back. It included 30 studies, around 4,000 hospitalized COVID-19 patients, and in this they showed that around 7% had bacterial co-infection. And if we looked at the bacterial co-infection overall in admitted patients, it was 7%. But if you looked at it in a mixed population, that is overall patients who were admitted either in ICU or in wards, then it was only 4%. But if you looked at ones which were admitted in intensive care, then up to 14% had co-infections. The commonest bacteria were actually atypical organisms like Mycoplasma, and then followed by gram-negative bacilli. 3% had viral co-infections, in which RSV and influenza were the commonest. And there were three series which were comprising of around 50 to 100 patients each, which said that around 4 to 6% had fungal co-infections, which were Candida and Aspergillus. Looking at just highlighting the same epidemiology, if you look at it here, so the most common ones are like Mycoplasma and Chlamydia, so atypical organisms, followed by gram-negative organisms, and then a very limited amount have MRSA. We frequently see patients receiving MRSA cover in the form of teicoplanin or linezolid or vancomycin. The evidence for it actually is more of fear, which has come from the influenza pandemic that we had. But here, so far, we did not have so many cases of MRSA, particularly in COVID-19. Then looking at viruses, so most of this data is basically coming from multiplex PCR, which is done in casualty or emergency medicine in developed countries. So we look at the usual suspects, which are RSV, influenza, and rhinoviruses, which comprise around 10 to 15% of cases. But whether they are bystanders or they actually change the severity of illness is actually not known at present. Then there were small studies which actually looked at serologic data, and I am showing this because the respiratory viruses are already there. But around 20% of the patients, this study only had 67 patients, out of which 30 had co-infections. So a small study, but it highlights one of another important atypical organisms, that is Legionella, which was serology was found positive in 20% of the cases in this study. Subsequently, coming to other infections like HIV. So far, the data on HIV actually comes from only case reports and case series. So this was another systematic review done recently, and it had around 252 patients, out of which 80% were male. Most of the data is from Europe and America, and most of them were diagnosed HIV on antiretroviral therapy. Only 13% had a low CD4 count. But even in such subgroup which had reasonably controlled disease, there were around 33% patients had severe disease, and 16% required ICU admission, and there was 14% mortality. So probably this is a subgroup which has somewhat higher mortality as compared to general population getting COVID-19. The risk factors for mortality were again the same as for other COVID cases, that is male gender, a higher age, and multiple comorbidities like hypertension and diabetes. Another important aspect to highlight here is that 32% patients in one of the study had RT-PCR positivity for COVID till day 40 of illness, which highlights that these patients will probably remain for longer periods in hospital as regarding our discharge strategies, which require RT-PCR negativity before discharge. So that is important aspect to note in retro-positive patients. Then subsequently coming to tuberculosis. So this is so far the only published report of tuberculosis. This actually is from Global Tuberculosis Network. They had taken cases from 8 countries from 3 continents, and around 49 cases were there. Most of them were middle-aged males, and had 17 to 20% had comorbidities. Around 73% had pulmonary tuberculosis, but 24% had both evidence of pulmonary and extrapulmonary tuberculosis. The strength of this study was that 90% had a microbiologic diagnosis based on smear culture or CBNAT. likely to see increasing surge in cases of dengue fever and COVID co-infections. Now, similarly, looking at data from French Guiana in 2020, we see that they had reported that there was increasing trend of increase in dengue cases reported week over week, along with increasing trend of COVID-19 that was reported week over week. So probably there is definitely a good chance that we'll be seeing these co-infections regularly now and in times to come in next few weeks and months. The important thing with dengue fever is that all of us know that up to 25% of dengue fever can actually have upper respiratory tract symptoms. On the other hand, we have significant proportion of COVID-19 patients that all of us have seen in our practice, which actually do not manifest with respiratory or predominantly respiratory symptoms. So they can have fever, malaise, and non-respiratory complaints as their presenting complaints of COVID-19. So that actually complicates the diagnostics a little bit. The next important thing is that suppose somebody is diagnosed COVID-19, then they get home isolated or quarantined, and then they miss this important period of late first week, early second week, which is important for early diagnosis and treatment of dengue fever. That is when the immune-mediated complications related to dengue hemorrhagic fever start appearing. Another important thing is whether dengue fever preceding COVID is a friend or foe, because both are RNA viruses, and whether innate immune response to one of the virus will actually blunt the severity of the other virus, we do not know. There are reports that there is some cross-reactivity of antibodies between dengue and SARS-CoV-2, but there is no definite literature as of date. So that again may complicate diagnostics at some point in time. This is our preliminary data of the co-infections that we have come across. This is in first 4,200 patients. So we have around 32 patients who we have diagnosed during admission as having either extrapulmonary or pulmonary tuberculosis. Around 35 who were found to be having only latent tuberculosis on while they were being evaluated for TB. 27 who had retroviral disease being diagnosed when they were admitted actually for COVID. This was during active screening. 12 with hepatitis B. So far, we have treated and discharged around 11 patients with dengue fever. We have around 5 patients who were identified as having aspergillus on the basis of culture positivity or galactomannan positivity, and 2 of rhinoorbital mucormycosis, one of which Dr. Saurabh just presented. So the limitation of whatever data I have presented on co-infections till now is basically that this is not a part of any prospective protocolized workup for identification of co-infections. So the denominators are unclear whether they are all admitted in wards or in ICU or non-admitted patients. Then the other important thing is that as we know, co-infections have many important aspects to look for. That is like age, spectrum of severity of COVID-19, and which cohort we are looking at. That is, if patients are immunocompromised or having hematologic or solid organ malignancies, etc. This will actually change the percentage of patients who develop co-infections. And again, the modes of diagnosis are also important, because there is logistic limitation on cytology or histopathology for diagnosis. Now, looking at common risk factors, so all of us know that COVID-19 actually leads to local immune response, dysregulation of local immune response, and dysregulation of various innate and adaptive immune response, which leads to respiratory tract and gastrointestinal tract dysbiosis, and which can lead to increased risk of respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. Also, there is immune suppression, altered immune response. This is related to the disease per se and the kind of drugs that we give, including steroids and immunosuppressants. So all of these lead to invasive fungal infections and can lead to reactivation of tuberculosis. The approach to diagnosis is very simple, that we should first have a high index of suspicion. Screening viral markers is what we have now started doing routinely in our admitted patients. We should keep a high index of suspicion for working up for seasonal infections in patients who are admitted, like dengue and malaria. Serologies for atypical organisms can be done when indicated. Now, as part of national guideline, we should work up for tuberculosis in all the patients who are admitted with COVID-19. We should have judicious use of imaging modalities. So if you have a bedside ultrasound, it is an important modality to use. And then CT and MRI can be used subject to availability. Multiplex PCR is also an important aspect of diagnosis subject to availability. And then there are tests like galactomannan and respiratory secretions should be sent for cultures whenever patients are able to produce, or in those patients who are on invasive mechanical ventilation. The challenges in management are that in bacterial co-infections, so they are not that common as I showed to you in non-admitted or mild patients. So we should use our antimicrobials judiciously. Atypical organisms are more common, as I showed to you. Most of them are basically chlamydia or mycoplasma or legionella, which are easily covered by macrolides or doxycycline. Then we should work up in admitted patients who are initiated on empiric antibiotics. We should try and work up and then narrow down our antibiotics using clinical markers, TLC, procalcitonin, and X-rays. And then it is important in patients who are admitted for prolonged periods with severe disease that bacterial infections are important causes of hospital-acquired and ventilator-associated pneumonia. So they should be diagnosed and treated as such. Looking at various recommendations for antimicrobial use, you can find basic emphasis is on diagnosis using your local epidemiology and susceptibility data, not using empiric antibiotics without any evidence just because of fear, and narrowing down the spectrum of antibiotics that we are using based on cultures and other investigations. So respiratory viral co-infections, so as I showed you the data, whether they are bystanders or whether they increase severity of COVID or whether COVID increases severity of other viral infections is actually not clear. Most of these, as I showed to you, are diagnosed in the emergency department. There is no definite therapy for most infections, but there is oseltamivir, which has been recommended in some guidelines when there is diagnosed influenza or high risk of influenza. Favipiravir is a drug which is now increasingly being used now for COVID, so that will cover for influenza. But in general, they should be treated on the lines of viral ARDS or COVID ARDS for that matter. HIV again can coexist with risk factors which predispose to severe disease. As I showed to you, there is reasonably high risk of severe infection and mortality in HIV. Plus, there is risk of co-infections, bacterial, fungal, and other opportunistic infections. Whether protease inhibitors, those patients who are on protease inhibitors prior to diagnosis COVID are whether it is protective or not, there is no clear-cut data. But these patients should be closely monitored for severe disease, also for presentations, atypical presentations, even in mild COVID. Then the other thing is that these patients will have prolonged RT-PCR positivity, so they will require prolonged hospitalization or isolation, depending upon local guidelines. COVID should be treated as per COVID severity, and ART should be initiated as per guidelines. Then looking at dengue fever, fluid therapy is an important aspect of treatment of dengue fever, but when we have moderate to severe COVID as a part of ARDS management protocol, we want actually restrictive or conservative fluid therapy. So we need to rationalize it on case-by-case basis and have a balanced approach. Another important thing is that dengue and severe COVID both have potential for thrombocytopenia. But however, we know that COVID actually is a pro-thrombotic state, and thromboprophylaxis is actually one of the cornerstones of management. But here, when we have diagnosed dengue, we should monitor platelet count, we should do an individual risk-benefit analysis and initiate mechanical thromboprophylaxis when drugs are contraindicated. The other important thing is liver involvement. Though remdesivir in vitro has been shown to have some anti-flaviviral activity also, but it has a reasonable possibility of liver toxicity, elevation of liver enzymes. So that needs to be very closely monitored in patients who are diagnosed concomitantly with dengue. Probably an alternate antiviral might be convalescent plasma if remdesivir is contraindicated and a patient needs treatment for COVID-19. Steroids again are a double-edged sword here. They are not actually indicated, or WHO guidelines say that they are not to be given in patient with dengue. But here in COVID, we actually need to give them in moderate to severe disease and in treatment of cytokine storm. So that is again another dilemma that all of us will face. And then, like Dr. Ved showed to you, the inflammatory markers actually can just get elevated as a part of capillary leak syndrome in dengue hemorrhagic fever. So whether it is dengue or it is COVID-related cytokine release is again, it is going to need clinical judgment to decide. So most of it is basically balancing our treatment using clinical acumen and laboratory parameters, and in general the condition of the patient. Tuberculosis, as we all know, there is a national guideline to work up for tuberculosis in all patients with COVID-19. There are diagnostic issues like Dr. Saurabh showed. If there is no sputum or the patient has extrapulmonary tuberculosis, then patients with severe disease receive immunosuppression, high-dose steroids, and tocilizumab, all of which are known for flaring up of latent tuberculosis. We have had patients of miliary tuberculosis ARDS, which is very difficult to then manage because the same presentation can be of COVID also. Then there are logistics of doing fine needle aspiration or biopsies in EPTB because of intervention and processing of samples, which has logistic issues. So we should suspect tuberculosis based on imaging and clinical findings, do early imaging, and try and do an early diagnosis and treatment. The other important issue is COVID per se can cause increase in liver enzymes, and then drugs used for COVID like remdesivir again can cause increase in liver enzymes, which can preclude standard ATT regimens. So that is another important management challenge. And then there is another issue of home isolation. When patients go home post-discharge, they might be isolated for another 7 or 10 days. So it can actually limit the efficacy or their reach of 2 dots therapy. So all of this has to be kept in mind for appropriate management of tuberculosis. Looking at fungal infections, we can actually, you can just think about both the diseases, that is severe COVID and fungal infections actually have common risk factors like diabetes, immunosuppression, and then per se in severe COVID, patients will be on multiple antimicrobials, will be immunosuppressed, have prolonged hospital stay. A lot of patients will have mechanical ventilation and inline catheters and IV lines, all of which predispose to fungal co-infections, especially Aspergillus and Candida. So all of that has to be kept in mind. Again, early diagnosis and management is required. Then issues in the management of fungal infections are that while I showed you hardly 3 to 4% of ICU patients had diagnosed fungal disease, but a lot of them get antifungals, especially echinocandins in severe COVID. Again, more because of fear rather than actually clinical diagnosis. So it is important to use clinical radiologic and microbiologic data to make a clear-cut diagnosis, to step down antimicrobials once we are able to narrow down the diagnosis or rule out fungal infection. Surgical management is dicey because there is data now on up to 50% patients with COVID-19 who undergo surgery have respiratory comorbidities and reasonably high mortality. So a risk-benefit analysis should be done. Acute kidney injury actually precludes giving conventional amphotericin, and then the liposomal amphotericin, voriconazole, echinocandins have higher cost of therapy and may not be available for all patients. This was a study recently published in Lancet, which looked at mortality in patients who underwent surgery in COVID-19. So around 1,100 patients were looked at, and the total mortality was 24%. But important was that up to 50% had pulmonary complications post-surgery. So this is important. I'm showing you this data because this was one of the reasons which was considered while the patient with mucormycosis was deferred surgery and was managed initially with more of medical management. So to summarize, co-infections with respiratory viruses are being reported. Bacterial and fungal co-infections are important, especially in severe disease and in patients of intensive care unit, admitted in intensive care. Tuberculosis, we should always be on lookout for, as 7% of patients of tuberculosis can present as community-acquired pneumonia. We should screen our patients for infections like hepatitis B and HIV. Now that the season has come, we should look for dengue fever in suspect dengue fever and work up for it. It is important to have to be on lookout for these infections, and microbiologic diagnosis is important. We should use our antimicrobials judiciously, and as I showed you, there are challenges, individual challenges related to infection severity, including immune-mediated complications like in dengue fever and issues with surgical interventions, especially in invasive fungal disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Pawan, for really comprehensively covering the topic and really providing us a very good insight into the co-infections that we are now seeing as far as along with COVID-19. We have a number of questions which have come through the WhatsApp, and I will start by asking Dr. Sareen the first question, which is a number of people have asked this, that since we're now saying that in all patients with COVID-19, we should also rule out tuberculosis, how would we diagnose TB if suspected? Because most of these patients have no sputum. And should all COVID-19 patients be evaluated for tuberculosis, or should we focus on a certain category if there is an atypical presentation? So, Dr. Sareen, over to you to answer these two questions.
Thank you, Randeep. I think it's very important to understand that this particular concept, that why do we consider this bidirectional screening? We have recommended that all TB patients should be, investigated for COVID and vice versa also. Now, obviously, it is important to understand that wherever there is a high index of suspicion in COVID patients, only there one would do the test for tuberculosis. And chest X-ray, in any case, is required to be done. So whether the sputum is there or not. So I would say that the newer molecular diagnostic tools which have greater sensitivity and early diagnosis are the preferred option as compared to the conventional smear examination in COVID especially. So definitely we would like to do a test for tuberculosis wherever we feel that there is a high index of suspicion, and not in all and each and every case of COVID.
Thank you. I think that point is well made, that it's not that you have to blindly test everyone who is COVID positive for tuberculosis. If you have an atypical presentation, or you find some lesion on the chest X-ray which is looking suspicious and you think it could be tubercular, or the symptoms are persisting for a longer period of time, then one would usually expect, as far as COVID is concerned, or patients having persisting cough with expectoration, hemoptysis, I think you should rule out active tuberculosis. As we've shown in the case presented, that sometimes you may be in for a surprise if you have a shadow on the X-ray which you don't really focus, and that patient had multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. The other issue to remember is that very often these patients are on treatment, including biologicals, which can lead to reactivation of tuberculosis, or latent focus can become reactive because of the drugs that they get, which are known to lead to reactivation of tuberculosis. And we don't really test all of these patients for latent TB, and because of the acute severity of illness, the risk-benefit analysis usually goes in favor of giving these drugs, but they can lead to reactivation of an underlying focus and cause active tuberculosis. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I have one question now for Dr. Aarti, which is basically, can we have an NS1 positivity which may be false, and can the COVID RT-PCR cross-react with dengue and chikungunya? So can you have a false report as far as NS1 is concerned, and with the COVID RT-PCR? There was some concern with the Vidal, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
So as far as, so first and foremost, I would like to say there's very little literature available as yet. We don't have a large number of cases where we could analyze the sensitivity, specificity, and cross-reactivity. But because there are different group of viruses, for other respiratory coronaviruses, it is possible to have some cross-reactivity in the IgM class of antibody, and that is also mostly dependent on the type of the kit that you have. So that is more important. NS1, there is no reason to believe should cross-react if you are doing a proper method of ELISA rather than a rapid test. So those have problems, otherwise it is all right. IgM antibodies are likely to have problems in all sorts of infections. So we have to be very careful in using IgM antibody as a method. Molecular methods are very sensitive and specific, and there should be no problem in the use of those methods. So I think maybe so that has answered.
Yes, thank you. I think you answered the question, and I hope it's become clear to everyone. I have one question for Dr. Manish Suneja, which is basically any contraindication for giving steroids in a patient who has both dengue and COVID-19. would you say that steroids should be given in a lower dose or should be avoided because of concomitant dengue infection?
So it is important to understand how these patients will present. So as we know, dengue predominates.
Manish, you can put the mic towards yourself.
So dengue, the vast majority of patients are mild, so is COVID. So probably it is best compartmentalized. So what is the patient presenting with? So vast majority will present with both mild dengue, mild COVID. Nothing much is required there. And then there will be a group where one disease will be predominant. So it may be COVID, it may be dengue. So a group of patients in this group where the COVID is predominant and dengue, let's say, is mild, there are no warning signs, then the management strategy that is there for COVID, that is use of steroids. So they should be used because the problem, the clinical status, the worsening that is being caused is being caused by COVID. The real problem arises when there is a severe patient who has both severe COVID and severe dengue. Now this proportion will be very small. But however, here also steroids have to be used as per in COVID management protocol. Previously also in dengue, steroids have been used. They have been tried as a treatment modality also. They have not shown any benefit, so they are not used. But as of now, in these co-infections, the use of steroids would have to follow that of COVID-19 management protocol.
Thank you very much. I have one now question for Dr. Anant Mohan, which is basically that in a patient with COVID-19, when should you suspect a superadded bacterial pneumonia and based on what criteria, clinically or radiologically, and what empirical treatment should you give?
Okay, so the initial presentation, of course, we don't know. It may be once the diagnosis has been made, the cough and the dyspnea will be there. The most of the times the cough is dry. There is no expectoration in most of the patients of COVID initially. So if we start the standard, either on radiology we have something very typical of a bacterial kind of a pneumonia, a lobar consolidation localized to one particular lobe on one side. So that is entirely different. But more often than not, we have that dry cough, we have some sore throat, and we have those bilateral airspace consolidations, bilateral peripheral in the mid and lower zones, which is typical of COVID. But in spite of the normal management, conventional management of the next few days, suppose the patient is not improving, or suppose he deteriorates after initial improvement, that is the fever maybe goes down and then comes up again, or the sputum production starts, the typical purulent sputum, leukocytosis occurs, or one goes in or desaturation, a person after without any reason he starts desaturating, becomes hypoxic, and if we do an X-ray and we see a new patch somewhere, these are the pointers that he may be having a superadded bacterial pneumonia also on top of the initial one. So then one will have to manage accordingly. Whether or not we are able to get a microbiological diagnosis depends upon the situation at that point of time. If we are fine, otherwise then yes, the standard protocol of antibiotics, empirical antibiotics, should be given. A combination of the beta-lactam, the amoxiclav that we give along with the macrolides would be probably a standard first choice, unless the patient is extremely critical, and then when we go in for the extended spectrum beta-lactamase and the cephalosporins and other injectables.
Thank you. So I think as Dr. Anant Mohan has just pointed out, you need to really look at the case presentation and the radiological picture. We know that we have a classical radiological picture of COVID-19 in terms of the X-ray and CT, which shows these peripheral ground glass appearance, whereas a bacterial pneumonia presents more like a consolidation with air bronchogram. And if you have a person who has symptoms which worsen or there's leukocytosis, then you will have to give antibiotics depending upon the background of the patient, whether you want to cover for community-acquired pneumonia or the patient has a hospital-acquired infection, and then based on what the sensitivity pattern of the surveillance data tells you. I have now one question which is basically for Dr. Rohit Sareen, which is that if you are suspecting tuberculosis in a COVID-19 patient, what would be the radiological picture that you should look for which should raise the suspicion? And what sample can you take in such a situation if there is no sputum being produced?
Thank you, Randeep. And I would say it's a very good question because these are common day problems that we face. And you see, radiologically speaking, tuberculosis shadows can mimic really any disease. In fact, sometimes we find that we are suspecting purely COVID on the basis of radiological picture, and we are surprised to see that the molecular diagnostics are positive for the disease, tuberculosis. So one should start suspecting primarily on the clinical grounds rather than rely entirely on a chest X-ray when we are talking of differentiating between the two, and two can also coexist. I mean, so that is to be kept in mind. Now, the other part is that what sample to be taken. The patient is not bringing out any sputum. So if the individual does not bring about sputum, you can only hedge on your clinical experience as well as on the radiological shadows, whether it is a plain chest X-ray or a CT scan. I mean, things like, the oropharyngeal swabs or, inducing cough and all, they could be used, but they are not really very helpful. Because in COVID, it is primarily a dry cough. And in such a situation, you will not get sputum in most of the COVID cases. And in that context, if it's extrapulmonary TB, then of course we can do an FNAC of the lymph node if it is present in any of the regions or from any other site. If there is a cold abscess, we could take a aspiration from there. So these are some of the things. But I would say that primarily in the absence of sputum, the diagnosis is clinical as well as based on a chest X-ray.
Look at the clinical radiological profile and then take a decision, because sometimes you may not be able to produce sputum, and really in the era of COVID and as a person who's COVID-19, sputum induction is something which we would like to avoid, because it is an aerosol generating procedure and it may actually cause more exposure both from tuberculosis and from COVID point of view to the healthcare worker. Therefore, you will have to look at the chest X-ray, which may show upper lobe infiltrates. If you have a fibrocavitary or a cavitary lesion, very unlikely that this will occur as part of COVID, and you should then strongly suspect tuberculosis, as was seen in the case that was also presented. But I'll just ask Dr. Rohit another question, which is an add-on to the question that I asked you, and that the doctor has written, will TB Gold be helpful in COVID-19 with suspected COX? So would you recommend the TB Gold to make the diagnosis? Your comments on this?
Well, you see, serological tests like TB Gold are only indicating infection. They do not indicate disease in any case. So I would say that in terms of diagnosing TB in such a situation, this test will not be helpful. But it would be helpful in saying latent TB. That, of course, is there because it tells infection. That is not disease.
Yes, I think it's a very limited or no role, as a matter of fact, because it will just give you an idea that there is underlying latent TB. It will not really tell you whether it's active or not. So I have now another question, which is also an interesting question, and which is basically to Dr. Manish, that in dengue there is increased hematocrit. And is that leading to an increased chance of thrombosis? And therefore, in such a situation, should you actually increase the anticoagulation that you give in a person who develops increased hematocrit? And there's another question which is from another person: in severe COVID and dengue hemorrhagic fever, how to balance the anticoagulants? So
again, theoretically, it is quite possible. But again, we look at it, most of the patients of dengue and COVID co-infection that we have come across, either both are mild or one is predominant. So we have a patient with dengue with severe thrombocytopenia, but COVID is it's not doing much there. And another group of patients where COVID is quite severe and dengue is just NS1 is positive, but as such, there are no symptoms. This will be a difficult group when we have both the disease coming as severe disease. This will be a small proportion of patients. And here the challenges would be there in management of rightly as thromboprophylaxis. In fluids, obviously we need to give fluids when there's hemoconcentration in dengue, and that is exactly opposite to what we usually do in COVID, severe COVID, when they are possible, we try to do a fluid restrictive strategy. So this is a challenge that we have to do on a case-to-case basis. We have to decide. So clinical judgment has to be supreme there. And regarding thromboprophylaxis, again, if dengue is severe, causing hemoconcentration, it's likely that thrombocytopenia will also be severe. Now, how to use low molecular weight heparin there is again a very difficult task. Probably we'll need to go by clinical judgment as well as monitoring of parameters. So D-dimer is very important thing. So a frequent monitoring of D-dimer would be warranted in such a patient. Usually we do it every 3-4 days in moderate patients. But when we are dealing with such a patient with co-infection, severe, both the sides, COVID and dengue, we probably do a daily D-dimer. And then with the composite of the clinical picture, the lab values, we need to take a decision on case-to-case basis.
Thank you. I think this is a tough situation that you have both diseases where the treatment strategy sometimes actually may be harmful for the other disease. And as Manish mentioned, you need to look at it on a case-to-case basis and do a risk-benefit analysis. And sometimes you may have to take a conscious decision as to what to do. Remember, in dengue, you have a critical phase which lasts for around 48 to 72 hours. And sometimes you just need to monitor these patients very closely during that point in time. A lot of people have argued that very often you may not even need to give platelets. They may fall down to even less than 20,000. But if there is no active bleeding, after about 24 to 48 hours, they will start rising and you may really not need to give significant platelets transfusion. So important things to keep in mind. But with COVID-19, it is a challenge because it depends which is dominant and which is causing more harm at that given point in time. One question that I have for Dr. Aarti is, a lot of empirical antibiotics are being given in this era of COVID-19, which is a viral infection. But if you look at what is being done, all patients invariably are being started on empirical antibiotics. Do you think it is justified, and will this actually, in the long run, lead to antimicrobial resistance?
So this is another great challenge for the management team, that when and whether to give antibiotics and what antibiotics to be given. So based upon the experience with influenza, a lot of super infections. So actually when you are talking of bacterial infections, it is mostly the secondary bacterial infections. And again, as was mentioned by Professor Guleria, that it is very important to determine whether it's a community acquired infection or it is a healthcare associated infection. So in the community, so you have to again, so that judgment based upon the laboratory findings, the X-ray, the clinical picture, you have to decide whether there is a bacterial super infection. And regarding the biggest challenge, mostly the healthcare associated infections are the one which are multi-drug resistant, and as is seen by most of the studies that are published till now, that they form a large majority with Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Klebsiella, which are multi-drug resistant. So there the empirical choice would be based upon your local epidemiology, and it has to be given to the patients who are in the ICU settings, who are ventilated or have some invasive respiratory therapy. Again, taking the clinical picture into consideration. But having said that, it should not be a blanket antibiotic treatment for all. Choose your empirical therapy, submit a specimen for cultures, and then de-escalate. So your empirical choice will be based upon your local epidemiology. One thing I would like to say, so it is difficult to get a sample. Usually we prefer bronchoalveolar or non-bronchoscopic BAL. So it is very difficult to get those samples in COVID patients, but people have tried using endotracheal aspirates and then using various semi-quantitative cultures and come to a definitive diagnosis to de-escalate. So at least I would like to say it should not be a blanket antibiotic treatment. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Aarti. I think the message is very clear that you should look at it on a case-to-case basis. In mild COVID infection, there's really very little role of giving antibiotics, and you just need symptomatic treatment. If you have moderate to severe patients, then you need to really look at the whole clinical picture, and if your patient is in the ICU, you may give empirical antibiotics, but you must always send your cultures as one would do before starting the antibiotics if possible, and de-escalate once you really get a culture sensitivity report. But really, the antibiotic choice should depend on multiple factors: the background from which the patient has come, does he have an underlying structural lung disease, or is there any chance of resistant pathogen, and what is the surveillance data in the community or in your hospital or in your ICU. It's important to keep that in mind. So I'll move on to finishing the questions on, or going ahead with the questions on infection. There's one question for Dr. Anant Mohan, and that is again empirical. Should antifungals be given empirically to all diabetics who have moderate to severe COVID-19? And this, I think, means that what would you do in this situation when you're giving high dose steroids? Should you start antifungal? And if you're giving anti-IL-6 drugs like tocilizumab, should you cover with antifungal?
Well, so firstly, it means that first question probably that whether should every patient who's moderate and who's on a kind of being given a diabetic patient should be covered. I don't think we really have adequate data for that, and I think that really may not be the way forward. Again, we are talking about not giving empirical antibiotics also blindly, so giving antifungals across the board again may not be the right way, unless so everything will have to be depending upon the clinical scenario of the patient. Yes, if we are really suspecting that he's a very high risk person for developing a fungal infection, we are giving biologicals, he's retrovirus positive, he's uncontrolled diabetes, then okay, you may take a chance, but even then empirical antifungals may not be always the solution. So I think one has to first treat the basic disease and try to treat the basic disease and control that as far as possible. Maybe if you want, then one can start the antifungals in those select group of patients who seem to be most critically ill and most susceptible to this the fungal infections, but not across the board.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Like we mentioned about avoiding a lot of empirical use of antibiotics, that applies to antifungal also. I have now two questions which are basically for Dr. Rohit Sareen. One is basically a question which I'll just read out because this is from a doctor from Bangalore, and she says she has a female patient aged 22 years who was asymptomatic but turned out to be COVID positive and had history of weight loss since last 2 months, was tested for sputum AFB and was detected to be positive. I presume it is drug sensitive. Should she be treated for COVID along with anti-tubercular treatment, or would we say that this COVID is incidental and we really don't need to do anything as far as COVID is concerned? She was asymptomatic, COVID positive, had history of weight loss for 2 months and was then evaluated and sputum turned out to be positive. Is also, if I'll just ask that also, that why is there a high mortality being reported with TB, COVID, co-infection? And this was something which even Pawan showed in his presentation of the data which is emerging from other countries. So Dr. Sareen, over to you.
Well, regarding the first question, you see, one of course is there, you'll have to start anti-tubercular treatment, and as Professor Guleria has said that we presume it is sensitive, so you will start on with 4 drugs as we would normally do. Now, regarding the treatment or any medication to be given for COVID, the individual is asymptomatic and you really don't need to do anything as far as this is concerned. However, you will have to monitor this patient closely, and you see, whenever there is comorbidity and whenever there is other respiratory infections along with COVID infection, the chances of progression of COVID disease as well as the primary disease are high. So we should not be complacent to the fact that, okay, the patient was asymptomatic as far as COVID is concerned. We should monitor the saturations, and we should look at the patient and accordingly manage. If the patient moves from, you see, mild to moderate, that has to be monitored very closely. And regarding the second question on mortality, yes, the mortality if TB and COVID coexist is high. It has been reported to be high in literature also. And even in the country context, when we examined, you see the COVID patients who had developed tuberculosis, the mortality in this group was also found to be much higher. And that was one of the factors which really prompted us to, do this COVID and TB, cross testing and all that. Because if we miss on certain things like tuberculosis, which is curable, we may unnecessarily add to the mortality in COVID. So I would say that yes, both of them in terms of severity will be related and may lead to mortality.
Thank you very much. So I think it really clears the picture. One issue is that if you have an asymptomatic COVID positive patient, you need to monitor that patient more closely, but there is really no indication to be aggressive in treating COVID in terms of steroids or giving remdesivir, but closer monitoring is required. And obviously you need to treat for tuberculosis as far as that patient is concerned. Many co-infections are associated with high mortality, and it's being observed in tuberculosis also. Also, one must remember that if you miss out the diagnosis of tuberculosis, many treatment that we are giving, including steroids and other drugs, may lead to more dissemination or tuberculosis becoming more fulminant, which may actually contribute to higher mortality also. So it's important to keep that in mind. One question which is there for Dr. Manish, which is basically HIV and COVID. Is there any preferred regimen for HIV, or we continue with the same drugs that we're giving as far as ART is concerned?
So basically, if we look at it, there are three groups of infections. One is chronic infections that a patient is having already. So for example, in this patient, this is PLHIV. So whether it's PLHIV, tuberculosis, and any fungal disease, the basic background regime that has been continuing for the patient from past, that needs to be continued during hospitalization. So a short duration hospitalization with COVID for 7 to 10 days, really nothing needs to change in this patient for PLHIV, and for that matter in any chronic disease like tuberculosis or fungal disease.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it's that's an important thing to keep in mind. I have a question for Dr. Anant Mohan, and this is regarding steroids. Now, the issue is that we are saying that steroids are useful as far as COVID-19 is concerned, and they are actually the only drug which has actually been shown to be having a mortality benefit. On the other hand, there is data, especially from H1N1, which shows that steroids actually may be harmful when we have influenza as part of an infection. So this question says, should we give steroids if there is influenza and COVID-19 co-infection? What would you advise as far as that is concerned?
Again, it will depend upon which is the more predominant disease. If it is a COVID co-infection and with the H1N1, and it is going into the moderate to severe category, we have to treat the severity of the disease. So that infection which is moderately severe, then one has to give a short course of steroids, because our ultimate aim is first to prevent the inflammatory storm, prevent the cytokine storm, and get him back. So, and then I think we can tackle whatever, if there are any repercussions or anything, any complication, then I think one can handle in that situation. Again, every patient with co-infection with H1N1 and COVID does not require steroids at all. Again, it has to be, so we follow the same guidelines as we do in general. A moderately severe patient who requires it, then he gets it, and in the meantime, we monitor for any complication and treat accordingly.
Fair enough, yes. So this is basically what was influenza ARDS. So if you have ARDS, which is basically either COVID related or influenza related, I would say that if you have co-infection, you would probably benefit by giving steroids at this point in time, because COVID is likely to cause a more severe reaction, but you will have to look at it on a case-to-case basis. So continuing with the influenza story, Dr. Aarti, there's a question which says, COVID and influenza co-infection, how will you diagnose this simultaneously? Can you do it in a single swab? And a question which I can then ask Dr. Anant is there a role for empiric treatment in such a situation? And as was mentioned, then should we give favipiravir, which will cover for both, or should we add oseltamivir, which is Tamiflu?
So, sir, one swab can be used to detect all viruses, but the method that you need is a little expensive. These are the ones which use syndromic approach, and you can test a number of viruses in one sample. Otherwise, we'll have to do 2 PCR reactions and have a specific test kit for each virus. So I think this is the time to have our laboratory services strengthened to do these multiplexing at the same time with the same sample to understand the epidemiology as well as in the management. So it is possible but expensive at present.
Yes, I think it is possible. You can do a panel and, like was mentioned, a multiplex testing, but most hospitals and centers are not doing it because of the cost. Otherwise, you can do a whole panel looking for fungal infections. Treatment.
Treatment, yeah, if it is confirmed, if H1N1 is confirmed, then the standard oseltamivir, the Tamiflu that we have can be prescribed. And then if there is anything from the other side, the COVID part, if there is any specific management for that, which is most often than not the anti-inflammatory, then that can be continued. So in fact, across the country, I would say already Tamiflu is being used quite a bit, even empirically, even when in some patients who are not responding, or if there is some other rhinitis or some other feature, so it is being used. But if we are confirming it, then we can add it on.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always going to be a challenge when it comes to this. Manish, there's one question which had come last time also, and that is regarding teicoplanin. Can we give it empirically, because there is some data that it may have some anti-inflammatory effect and may be useful otherwise also as far as COVID-19 is concerned? This is based on one brief article which had suggested this. So any comments that you would like to make?
So actually, there are many such reports, not only teicoplanin, many other drugs, I think, and utilizing a high-end antibiotic for its anti-inflammatory action may be a great overkill. And also, we are forgetting the antimicrobial resistance part. So no, simple answer will be no. There are many other drugs which have been shown brief reports, but yet as of now, nothing is conclusive except for the standard treatment regimen that we are following. We won't be using such antibiotics for any anti-inflammatory action thereof, anything like that.
Thank you very much. One question that I have, and we're now really reaching the last part of our grand round, because so this is a question to Dr. Rohit Sareen. This is basically, how do I differentiate between miliary TB ARDS and COVID ARDS? Is there any way to differentiate between the two?
It is, you see, as I say that a lot depends on the clinical picture, and a more acute onset of the illness goes more in favor of COVID. A more chronic disease process which has been there for a couple of weeks or months and ultimately leading on to ARDS goes more in favor of tuberculosis. So our clinical judgment is of paramount importance whenever we are talking of miliary shadows. The other thing is that yes, if we have samples available, then they can be tested for COVID as well as being tested for TB. And as I've said, that both of them could coexist also. So in terms of the management strategy, one will have to look case to case. In case it is only TB, then obviously we will have to treat for that. If it is only COVID, we'll have to manage it. But definitely we'll have to manage the ARDS component of it, which we will usually do in the ICU setting. And that is all I can offer. But you see, when we are talking of radiological appearances, there is really nothing which we can say for TB that, okay, this is going to be sacrosanct TB. And whenever we are talking of biliary shadows, there could be many other things there.
I think it's going to be difficult, and your focus should be that if you have a high index of suspicion, and if the person has ARDS, he's intubated, you must work on getting a good sample. So you may do a bronchoscopy or a lavage and try and get a good sample to really confirm the diagnosis of tuberculosis, and if the suspicion is very strong based on clinical radiological ground, as we've said, you may even consider empirical treatment. One final question for Dr. Manish, which is interesting. Two questions, as a matter of fact. One is, of course, your experience in combating superadded MDR infection in the ICU, especially when these patients are on steroids and tocilizumab. How frequently are we seeing MDR and fungal infection in severe COVID who are on steroids and tocilizumab? And in terms of steroids, any use of giving deflazacort?
So, in terms of secondary infections, severe COVID, admitted in ICU, ventilated, and the frequency of secondary infections, MDR organisms, what we find till now, it's quite similar to what we get in our ICU, that is non-COVID ICU that we always used to have. The organisms are also similar. The resistance profile is similar as far as MDR bacteria are concerned. So we follow the same strategy. Only when we have the reports, we would like to escalate the antibiotics to cover for that as per sensitivity pattern. For fungal, one really needs to be aware of the local environmental factors, the local epidemiologies. For example, for our we usually see invasive pulmonary aspergillosis in someone around median 7 to 8 days after intubation. So wherever we get it around that time. So rather than empirical antifungal, we would like to be more vigilant around this time point, around a week of illness. We would like to send the investigations, galactomannan, your minival or some tracheal aspirate investigations. So we'll be vigilant and be sending for these investigations at this point in time, around 1 week of illness. Also, we will look for blood candida infections. And also important, yes, these patients have lymphopenia. They get steroids, and at times they are also getting tocilizumab. They are at increased risk of infections, yes, but at the same time, it is also difficult to monitor these patients as we do in our non-COVID areas for infections. So surveillance sort of thing should be there. And in our experience, I think the rate of infections are quite similar to what we get in a non-COVID ICU.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you need to really evaluate these patients. If you are aggressive and your treatment strategy is good, it's not that you will have a very high chance of opportunistic infection occurring in these individuals. We've run out of time. There are other questions which we'll try and take by sending a reply through the WhatsApp messages. So I just would like all the panelists to give their final comments or take-home messages, and I'll start with Dr. Sareen. What is your take-home message to all the audience that are there as far as COVID and other co-infections is concerned, with the focus on tuberculosis?
I think one thing is very clear, that one must always keep TB in mind whenever you are seeing a radiological picture when investigating a patient of COVID. That's very clear. The second thing is that in case you are in doubt in terms of diagnosis of TB and the patient is moving on from moderate to severe and not responding to your usual treatment, then do not hesitate to start treatment. You could give empirical anti-TB treatment, because here we have a treatable, curable disease, and we are sometimes, you see, not very clear TB or not TB. Normally speaking, when we are in doubt, we will not treat. But with COVID there, we will hedge on the side of treating rather than not treating. So that should again be clear. In a high index of suspicion, even if definitive diagnosis of tuberculosis is not there, we will treat an individual if he has concomitant COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manish. What is your take-home message?
So we have already entered the period of the year when we have all these infections, tropical infections, whether it's dengue, malaria, viral hepatitis, leptospirosis, scrub typhus, etc. And soon we will be in the winter period when we will have many viral infections, maybe H1N1 also. So it is important time that we strengthen our diagnostics, because most of the times these COVID centers are standalone or in the site at a particular facility. So this is something where we can use more of rapid diagnostic tests, and probably importance of surveillance also, like surveillance of H1N1 among the samples being sent for COVID. That will give us a good idea whether to use something like oseltamivir empirically. If there's, let's say for example, if we are getting some H1N1 in our hospital samples which we are sending for COVID, if H1N1 is positive, we would like to give oseltamivir as a group to all our patients in that time period. So it's important to have a very strong diagnostics and keep our index of suspicion very high. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Aarti Kapil, your take-home message.
Yes. So again, extension of what Dr. Manish has said, please include specific diagnosis, laboratory diagnosis in your management protocols when you are preparing one. Try to have more cultures, so encourage testing, and which will depend upon the prevalent, whatever is the endemic infection. So you will have some community co-infections, you will have all healthcare associated infections. So please add all the specific laboratory tests in your management algorithms, and do not give empirical antibiotic as a blanket. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the last part is very important. Dr. Anand Mohan, your take-home message.
Same as other colleagues, that we are now 7-8 months into the pandemic now, and gradually regarding the basic coronavirus, we are having a bit of experience in management, but at the same time, one should be aware that if we find a person who is not responding the way he should, or if after initial improvement there is deterioration, unexplained problems, something unexplained is coming up, then we should quickly kind of switch our minds away from COVID and try to look at other things also. And especially if a person has comorbidities which may predispose him to other commoner infections that are already prevalent in our area, then I think we should be even more vigilant and start investigating upfront also, so that we don't miss anything and we are able to pick it up early and treat early.
Thank you very much. I think the points are very well been made, and the cases also highlight this, that as this pandemic moves into its 10th month, we need to be really cognizant of co-infections that can occur with COVID-19, and also the superadded infection which can occur because of the opportunistic infections which are there because of steroids and other drugs which are being given. Remember, very often in such cases, COVID can also be an asymptomatic bystander, in terms of that it is just diagnosed because of the pandemic that you're doing more testing, but patient may be asymptomatic, as was the case presented by the doctor from Bangalore, that the person was having weight loss for more than 2 months, other symptoms were going on for a longer period of time, and was then incidentally investigated and diagnosed to be COVID positive, but was asymptomatic. So keep that in mind. You must have a low index of suspicion, and especially if the presentation is atypical, doesn't fit into classic COVID presentation, and you must test upfront. So challenges are in the diagnosis and then subsequent the treatment, especially as we mentioned in dengue. But test upfront if you find that there could be some other cause of the clinical presentation that the patient has, which doesn't fit into a classical COVID profile, or it doesn't behave as a COVID positive patient. This is the basic messages that I think we wanted to give. And of course, the more important message is that when we have not to use a lot of empirical antibiotics and antifungal, because that itself can also lead to antimicrobial resistance, which can cause more harm than good in the long run. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists. Dr. Rohit Sareen, who's the former director of LRS Institute of Tuberculosis and Respiratory Diseases. Thank you very much for coming on board and answering questions on tuberculosis and COVID-19. Dr. Aarti Kapil, Professor of Microbiology at AIIMS New Delhi. Dr. Anant Mohan, Professor and Head Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine, and Dr. Manish Suneja, Additional Professor of Medicine at the All Institute of Medical Sciences. Thank you all, and I'd also like to thank our case presenters, Dr. Ved from Medicine, Dr. Saurabh, and Dr. Pavan, who presented excellent cases. I think they were really cases which really had a strong message, and Dr. Pavan really covered the topic of COVID-19 with co-infection very, very well. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again next time with another topic in the COVID grand rounds that the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi holds along with Niti Aayog. Thank you and see you next time.